Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, which is generously underwritten by Sage, we're going to be talking about the power of documentaries as learning tools. And in that discussion, we'll cover the full range of documentary instruction, from creation to classroom. We'll talk about instructional techniques, learning outcomes, distribution models, and, of course, effective librarian and faculty collaborations. We're lucky to be joined by a fully cross-functional group of guests, including a librarian, filmmakers and producers, faculty, and a publisher-distributor. Joining me are César Hernandez, a documentary filmmaker who most recently directed and produced the film Unseen. Virginia Espino, a film producer and continuing lecturer at the César E. Chávez Department of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies at UCLA. Sarah Feinblum, a filmmaker and the founder of the documentary film production and distribution company Good Docs. Gisèle Tanasse, film and media services librarian at UC Berkeley, and Michael Carmichael, senior director, library editorial at Sage, which acquired Good Docs toward the end of 2024. In this 3rd episode of our series, we dig into the academic impact of documentaries and discuss measuring learning outcomes, librarian and faculty partnerships, and the importance of access and representation in films. Okay, so Virginia and Gisèle, I wanted to circle back with the two of you, and just looking at some of the academic impacts we're seeing coming out of documentary usage. And so, Virginia, if you could talk a little bit about some of the unique opportunities, I guess, in sort of measuring learning outcomes when using documentary films as instructional tools.
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. Measuring learning outcomes is, something that we are expected to do, we need to do, but it's not always easy when we're talking about social justice issues, when we're talking about racism, or we're talking about structural racism. You can't really, make a quiz to measure how much someone has understood. So what I like to do is I like to have large group discussions. I like to also have the students discuss among themselves. I do teach large classes, so sometimes small group discussion is really impossible, especially when the seats don't move; they're nailed to the floor.
Yeah.
So we do what is called peer share. So we'll have people talk to each other who are sitting next to each other. I usually give students prompts, discussion prompts before we watch a documentary film.
Okay.
And then either we'll have, like I mentioned, peer share or large discussion groups around those prompts. So I'm really looking for students to be engaged with the themes. I'm not trying to test their knowledge. I'm trying to test more how they're engaged with the topics that the films present. I also utilize the course website that provides students an opportunity to respond to a question prompt at the same time that they're watching the documentary film. I also like to have the students handwrite their responses or their reflections, because I feel like there's so much time spent on computers, on the laptop, that sometimes it's just important to shut it and get out a pencil and paper and put your feelings down in that way, or put your reflections down, or respond to the question prompts. So I do a variety of things in my classes to keep them engaged, to in some sense test their understanding of some of the themes that I'm presenting.
I bet it also, I would assume it also kind of has sort of this effect of having the what they've learned just sink in a little bit more too, and they get an opportunity to sort of talk it through with somebody, that it actually locks in a little bit more.
Absolutely. And they're all different. They all come from different backgrounds, different experiences. And so while they might share the same ethnic or racial identity or gender identity, um, their perspective is different.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they contribute, they are teaching their classmates
Yeah.
their perspective. And so they're learning from each other, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
learning from them.
Yeah.
So I wish that my classes were smaller so we could have more time to discuss, because that's such an important aspect of the college classroom that I feel is really in danger when we look at the budget cuts that
Yeah.
are coming our way, and that have
Mm-hmm.
already happened, as a matter of fact.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Gisèle, do you want to add anything to that? Are you seeing similar techniques? And
Yeah, so just want to celebrate some of these beautiful, meaningful experiences that Virginia is offering to her students. I think librarians too can be partners to teaching faculty around crafting and designing some of these kinds of learning experiences, especially things that can be multimodal. So if we think about maybe some videographic criticism in addition to writing, having these multimodal experiences that help students to really synthesize and be thinking critically. I also think a lot too. The part of my title I don't often talk about very much is I'm the assistant head of our instruction division, so I'm very much an instruction librarian, and so crafting experiences that have students putting different resources into conversations with each other is, I think, particularly exciting for them to do, not just with scholarly articles. It's kind of like traditional librarianship, but also with media specifically. And how do we put some of these documentaries into conversation with each other? Because you are navigating frequently very diverse viewpoints. And so seeing it as a media literacy opportunity for the students to put actual video into conversation with each other.
mm-hmm. When you're doing that, Gisèle, are you actually, partnering with faculty on those types of exercises? And
Yeah, so we offer consultations through our instruction department with faculty members on curricular design. So frequently those are maybe more around like databases. We do a lot of like text, searching different databases and comparing the types of things that are in those databases. But when you think, the typical university is subscribing to several different video platforms and looking what kind of content is featured in this particular platform, for example. In that way, you're kind of teaching everyone to be their own librarian in a sense, and that's the goal, right? We're looking to help students to build a toolkit, really being critical consumers or critical users and critical students of media.
Mm-hmm. So kind of expanding on that, Gisèle, I mean, in terms of like media literacy or info literacy, can you be more specific in terms of how documentaries kind of contribute to that? Like, what are some of the exercises around that, to develop those skills?
Sure. We have, when we think about like how media is typically used in instruction, frequently that's around clips, right? It's not this sort of passive watching the full film. Sometimes feels like you're maybe like a substitute teacher trying to burn through classroom time, right?
Yeah.
And that's not to say that they shouldn't watch the full film. And that's the beauty of streaming, is that you can assign that full film to students to view outside of class, and then in class kind of pick these perfect clips where you might engage them in a very wonderful critical question, right? That's what Virginia was talking about, is supporting instructors to like find the time to craft sort of the perfect reflection question. And so engaging students sometimes on finding which of those clips are best. So even the students themselves identifying a clip, writing a short reflection on it. How does this relate to the readings in our class? How does this relate to the other films which we've watched.
Mm-hmm.
And you can think about putting some of these films that are about Indigenous reproductive rights and Indigenous health. You could put several documentaries into conversation with each other in that way and engage the students with sort of what resonated with them most in the film, rather than having it be the instructor who's highlighting what resonated most with them.
Mm-hmm. It just occurred to me, I'm curious, Gisèle and Virginia, just thinking back on what Sarah was describing when she the types of films that she kind of gravitated towards in terms of putting onto her platform, onto the Good Docs platform. She had talked about, some of the, films that she did not want, the more extractive ones, as she put it. Do you actually look at that, with your students in terms of the documentary format itself, like in terms of what makes a good one and what makes one that's, more superficial or commercial or extractive, as Sarah mentioned? Do you look at that with the students and help them understand, which ones are the ones that really can be helpful towards, their learning?
Okay, I'll start. Well, I'm an oral historian by training, so I've learned over time about centering the narrator, about trying to be trauma informed.
Mm.
So trying to address a lot of what Sarah described.
Yeah.
That's my practice.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely am looking for films that it's hard to tell if something's extractive per se, because you don't always know what happened on the back end. But what I try to do in my classes is talk about what is centering, and how these films center the person's experience
Mm.
versus, like what Sarah mentioned, like a white savior approach.
Yeah. Right.
We don't know if, I don't think, she probably knows more about the filmmakers themselves than I do. So I don't know if somebody has helicoptered in and, captured the story and then helicoptered out and is now onto a different story. Um, but the idea that how the story is framed
Yeah.
is really important.
Mm-hmm.
How the story is told, from what perspective, whose perspective is elevated. I think that all of those are really important questions that we talk about when watching documentary films.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, kind of riffing on that, can you talk a little bit about, why access and representation? I mean, we've talked a little bit about this up to this point, but why access and representation in documentary films are important components of student education, particularly as we were talking about fostering that critical thinking and cultural awareness and media literacy. Gisèle, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we heard very compellingly from Seth earlier how
Yeah.
important it is to hear and see things that touch on your own story and experience. And so that truly is the greatest power, I think, of documentary film and in education, is the ability to bring just very diverse perspectives and viewpoints into the classroom and into independent study as well. And I think too, the ability to really defy the limits of time and space. Like, that's one thing that documentary film can do for the student. I think too, we have this idea that all content is just freely available to everyone, that everything is accessible. And now that AI is synthesizing it to us for us. So knowing everything is possible. And there's so many perspectives and experiences that slip through the cracks because of the financial elements involved in these things, and because of privilege. And systems of power.
Mm-hmm.
And so, our ability to collect, I think, as librarians and to preserve can be limited by our own experiences and the lack of awareness about the world and people in it. But at the same time, I think this sort of critical moment in our history, we see how important it is to have custodians of cultural history.
Yeah.
And to truly be engaged on a level of recognizing the human dignity of all people. And that is something to be cherished and cared for.
Yep. Excellent. Virginia, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to add that we're talking about films in terms of contemporary and what's recently been acquisitioned. But I'd also like us to think about like the body of work that has been made over time in terms of documentary films and the archive of human experience that we have since people started making documentary films. There are some amazing documentaries that I show today that were made in the 80s, that look at gender studies, that look at, for example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire or Rosie the Riveter. A lot of those people who were interviewed are no longer with us today. So the ability to see them represented today in the 21st century visually is pretty remarkable. And I think it's just a wonderful time trip back into a time period that our students just are not familiar with, are not really connected to, because today's a little different. But say 10 years ago, they lived in a time where, abortion access was available, where, we had funding for projects, documentary film projects, et cetera. So looking at a period when people didn't have that, was really profound.
Yeah.
So I really like the representation over time of the body of work that filmmakers have created, filmmakers of color, women filmmakers, etc.
Excellent. Thank you for saying that. That's an excellent point. You just heard from Set Hernandez, a documentary filmmaker who most recently directed and produced the film Unseen, Virginia Espino, a film producer and continuing lecturer at the César E. Chávez Department of Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies at UCLA, Sarah Feinblum, a filmmaker and the founder of the documentary film production and distribution company Good Docs, Gisèle Tanasse, film and media services librarian at UC Berkeley, and Michael Carmichael, Senior Director, Library Editorial at Sage. Join us next week as we talk about how to utilize engagement data for collection development of documentaries and other visual media. We also discuss the sustainability of documentary film production in today's political climate. This series is underwritten with generous support from Sage. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.